Streaming live. All right. Thank you everybody for your patience. We are trying to figure out Facebook Live, the stream directly from Zoom. I am Ellen Desmond. I am the Special Projects Coordinator at the Bureau of Student Wellness in the Office of Social and Emotional Wellness. So thanks for joining us today for our afternoon bell session, sponsored by the Bureau of Student Wellness. So this is our daily series designed to support you and your efforts to foster health and wellness in New Hampshire students and educators and families during this time of remote instruction. So you can follow us on Twitter at NH Schools. You could follow us on YouTube, or certainly explore us and our Facebook page. You are on it right now. And you can also take a look at nhlearnsremotely.com. We have lots of different resources that we're adding to every day. So today I'm excited to kick off this first series of our guest lecture afternoon bell sessions, featuring exemplars in the field of student wellness. And I'm joined by Dr. Cassie Yackley for trauma-informed responses to global crisis, brain-based approaches to staying socially connected during physical distancing. So Cassie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ellen, and thank you for your persistence in getting us set up. That was a challenging thing, but you stayed very calm. Nice management of stress. So thank you for having me come and talk a little bit about what we know about the stress response system and how that's really important to how we keep ourselves and those around us sane and healthy during the midst of the crisis. And my plan today was to go ahead and pull up just an abbreviated form of a PowerPoint presentation just to provide some visuals and to guide our discussion. But this is meant to be brief, and it's just a piece of thinking about our stress response system for today. And I'll just imagine seeing all of your amazing faces out there. I miss seeing you all in person and can't wait until we have an opportunity to be in proximity for real with each other again. So hello virtually for now. And I'm gonna go ahead and try to share my screen, Ellen, and see if we can now, in the 15th layer of technology, get my PowerPoint to pull up. Oh, it looks a little bit different. Great. Can you see it now, Ellen? Awesome. So I will pause. I know Ellen is on deck, at least in terms of managing questions for today, given the modality of the presentation. So as she mentioned before, I know we have a foundation in this. This is something that we've been talking about for the last number of years, really thinking about how to manage adversity and trauma. And I want to remind folks that this is something we've been devoted to, and we have a really good understanding of ways to mediate our exposure to stressful and threatening events. And that picture right there is Nova Scotia, where I was supposed to go and visit in a couple of months. I'm a little sad I won't get to go back to that beach, but it makes me smile just to look at and remember being there at this point. So for those of you who know me, you know I always start talking with folks with this orientation slide, and it seems more important today and now than it ever did before. And what I've said to folks is when we think about trauma-informed care or trauma responsiveness, that the foundation or what it really means is that everybody has a story, and that story is really important to who we are and who we are in relationships and how we manage stress and adversity in our lives as well. And so I hope we all take this moment in time to pause, to slow down for a little bit and check in with ourselves. And if our goal is to be helping students or other people around us, we're only going to be able to do that to the degree to which we're understanding where we are and how we're managing. And I understand, in my thoughts and wishes to all of you who have your own story right now around what's happening. So I'm going to count on you today, Ellen, too, that if there are questions or something doesn't make sense, just guide me and follow up. So what I just put up here is a slide about the stress response system, and we can thank Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory And if we've talked together before, you've heard me talk about this window of tolerance. And again, our focus today is really thinking about this stress response system and simple things we can do now in order to get us back into, as you see here, the window of tolerance. And so this nice way of representing stress reminds us that there aren't just two ways that we handle stress, which is a sympathetic way that we get ready to fight or flight, or a parasympathetic way in which we calm down. There's actually 3 states that our vagal nerve, the largest nerve in our body, can engage in depending on events around us and how we perceive those events and the kind of experiences that we have had in the past. And we all can fall outside of the window of tolerance or the optimum zone of arousal. And in fact, doing that in healthy, supportive kind of ways builds a resistance and a tolerance to stress moving on. But if we find ourselves outside of that window of tolerance in a way that we can't bring ourselves within the window, or we're spending large amounts of time in another arousal state, then that can become problematic in terms of what that means for our bodies. And so as you see here, where we all want to be is this ventral vagal social engagement response. And it's when we feel calm. They call it rest and digest, because you can take a deep breath. It allows your digestive system to work, and why many folks have GI related issues when they're experiencing ongoing stress. And then you'll notice at the bottom there, it says, at the bottom of that first item, it slows the fear response. And it allows for connection and co-regulation. And we all know that the second most important thing in terms of our brain and our brain functioning, aside of our management of fear, is how relationships mediate the management of that fear response. And so we want to be in a place where we can capitalize and use the regulation and the safety of people around us. But if we then perceive a state of danger and we move into a hyper aroused response, then it results in all of the changes that we know are associated with our brain functioning in terms of the limbic system and the amygdala firing, acknowledging that there's a threat in front of us, operating with the brainstem and the diencephalon to mobilize us to get out of that particular situation. But there can be another circumstance. If we're in a setting, if we've had generations of our culture, our people, or we've been in a home where we've not been able to escape circumstances which were overwhelming, like child abuse or domestic violence, then we go into a freeze response. The adaptive response is to distance yourself, to numb away from your emotions and from time and from thoughts, and to go away in a happy place in your mind for a period of time. And so if folks have prolonged periods, you get a sense of helplessness as a response to whatever that threat is. And we can all vacillate with some of those, though you tend to see people that tend to be primarily hyper aroused in response to threat, and people who get just more comatose, more quiet, and more subdued and more withdrawn in the express of or in the experience of stress. So we're just reminding ourselves here, so the most important thing we can do right now is to try to get as many of us as we can back into that window of tolerance. Because when we're in that window of tolerance, it allows us to use our brains in ways that we make good decisions and we think creatively about the situations in front of us. So I've talked with folks when we talk about trauma responsive schools and trauma informed care about brain development over time. And what I'm pointing us to now is that the way in which our brain functions also operates in a hierarchy. And so I put 2 side-by-side images for you here today. And one is a model of a brain so that you can see the way in which these different brain regions are layered upon each other. And as you all know, I'm sure, the lowest regions of the brain, like the brainstem and the cerebellum, which is part of the diencephalon, are the earliest parts of the brain to develop. They also are the regions that are most active when we're most threatened in particular situations. And then we move up the brain to the limbic system and the cerebral cortex. Now, if you draw your attention instead to the right-hand image, this is Bruce Perry's slide, and with permission, I'm sharing a couple of different slides and ideas from his work around the neurosequential model. And so if you line that brain up, as you can see then, that pink bottom part is our brain stem. The next yellow portion up is the diencephalon and the cerebellum, and so on and so forth. And if you look at that very bottom part in the brainstem, you'll notice that there are 3 circles located those, and those represent the roots or the origins of our neurotransmitter systems. And as we've talked about before, those are all of the chemicals that are released in our brain and regulate our mood and arousal and different types of functioning. It's what we use psychopharmacological medicines, right, in order to adjust what that level of neurotransmitter. And just for folks' reference, what you see are the 3 primary neurotransmitters involved in these functions, which are DA, that's dopamine, and NE, which is norepinephrine, and SER, which is serotonin. And as you can see, as the brain grows over time, they begin to develop extensions, if you will, or neuronal connections all the way up our brain to the cortex. But what's important to think here is those things are all connected and they're all rooted from very early brain regions in terms of that development. And then if you look on the very far right-hand side, generally speaking, you see the human functioning, the ways in which each of those brain regions help us to function. So in the bottom part around the brainstem and the diencephalon, you see our body temperature, our heart rate, our sleep, our satiety, and then up into arousal and motor regulation, which is really regulated by the diencephalon and cerebellum. And then moving on up, right, the limbic system with emotional responsivity, sexual behaviors, and attachment behaviors with other humans and affiliation. And then at the very last, we have our prefrontal cortex. So the last to develop, also the last to be able to be capitalized on when we're in a state of stress. And we're going to pick that apart in a very detailed way. So Ellen, you're my sole participant in terms of where I'm at right now. Is this making sense as I'm talking through this?
It is. It's fascinating. And it's great just to give a visual of what's going on in here for us, for our students. Yeah, it's fantastic.
So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of like tip this image on its side, if you will, when we begin to look at the next tables, right? If we just kind of tip this over, so the brainstem then was on the left and our cortex was on the right-hand side. And I'm going to spend a bit of time talking today. It'll be the primary bulk of what I wanted to share for this session, at least. I want to talk about state-dependent functioning. So it depends on where we are in that arousal state, going back to that window of tolerance and that continuum of arousal response, dictates how our brain functions, and therefore the kinds of capabilities that we have at our disposal during those particular times. So we're going to just start right here in this calm column, presuming that none of us were in the midst of a pandemic, and we could be perfectly calm at this point in time, and not that the world wasn't having all kinds of traumatic experiences prior to that. So if we're in an internal state and our experience is that we're calm, right? We feel restful, then the primary part of our brain that we're able to use is the neocortex and the subcortex, or that prefrontal cortex region. And people tend to respond, as we've talked about in the past, some of us, in more, as we saw from the other slide, an arousal state, a hyperarousal state, or a dissociative removal kind of state. So if I'm calm and I'm somebody who has an arousal response, it's still going to be restful in this column. And in dissociative, I'm still going to be present and restful. So if those things are happening and I'm able to operate out of my neocortex and subcortex, then I can engage in abstract thinking, problem solving, creativity, all of the things, frankly, that we need to figure out given circumstances right now. And that has an impact on 4 ways of functioning, and we don't have time to get into all of those today, but one of those is time. It also includes our sense of our body, our sense of our thoughts, and our emotions. Maybe we can look at that another day. But if I'm able to use my neocortex and I feel calm, I can engage in this abstract thinking, and my sense of time allows me to engage in extended and future-oriented thought. And the brain region that I'm able to utilize, as you can see, is I get a good degree of functioning from our neocortex, 85% of that functioning, 90% of my limbic system, the emotional way in which I function, and our lower brain, that brainstem and diencephalon, really isn't guiding a ton of our behavior, right? That reactive behavior, it's like 10% of it. It's still on guard, but safe, but it's not present in our moment-to-moment functioning when we're in a state of calm. So now what happens if through neuroception process, right, that implicit scanning for danger, we begin to say, oh, maybe there's some threat. Then we might move up here. We move into this alert state. And this doesn't have that profound of implications for our capacity to engage in cortical thinking, but it becomes more emotionally driven, as you can see. So when I'm alert, my subcortex is able to function, less of that really front prefrontal cortex region. More emotion is guiding that. If I'm rising up the arousal continuum, I'm going to just become a little bit more avoidant. Now think of students, if they're dissociative in their response, with so many kids who have complex and ongoing trauma are, the dissociative response there is avoidance. Whatever it is, task avoidance, work avoidance, relationship avoidance, I'm beginning to disconnect from those things. And if my subcortex and my limbic system are driving my functioning, then my cognitive style is going to be much more concrete. And I want you to think about the kinds of planning and the kinds of cognitive tasks that we're asking not even students to do, but adults and staff members to do. And if we're trying to make plans long term, there probably aren't a lot of folks, myself included, that can think beyond hours and days right now, maybe weeks right now, to figure out what's going to happen. But this long-term planning, not surprisingly, is going to be more challenged. Now you'll notice I didn't put brain region accessibility in each quadrant because it's more of a continuum. So you can look at the very left-hand side is regulated, and the middle is somewhat dysregulated, and then on the far right-hand side on that bottom column will be highly dysregulated. But as you can see already, they're going to start to have this shift, right? A little bit, maybe somewhere between 85 and that 10% of neocortex functioning. Limbic system functioning, our ability to reasonably use emotions to guide our behavior, even become more limited. And we begin to see that lower brain functioning taking over more and more of our decision making and our behavior on a moment-to-moment basis. Okay, so now what if we continue to move up the alarm or up the arousal continuum? And let me just remind you that prior experiences with trauma or threat increase our sensitivity to future experiences of threat. You're going to move up the arousal continuum much quicker when you've been a kid, for example, and you've been exposed to violence, or you're living in foster care, or those kinds of things. Your system, as we've talked about, has that kindling effect. It's been sensitized, so you can zoom up the arousal cycle really quick. And again, that's not just true for kids, it's true for caregivers and us adults that have already had those kinds of circumstances. So in that alarm state now, as you can see, we're really moving down the brain in terms of functioning. Emotions are guiding a lot of what we do, and down into those midbrain regions. If I'm on an arousal continuum, you start to see a resistance or crying to things. And if I'm on the dissociative continuum, you get this kind of just going along with things, robotic compliance with things, but it isn't, they're not really taking anything in or learning from the experience. You're just kind of going along with what somebody says in order to reduce the amount of threat in front of you right now. So your cognitive style is highly emotional at those points in time, and your ability to have a sense of time, we're looking at hours and minutes, not days, right? Not weeks, not next year. And so the way we respond need to be responses that are happening more in the here and now, more in the hours and minutes, and how somebody's going to get through the next hour, for example. And I'm not going to reiterate the functioning on that bottom level because we talked about it on that last slide, or on that last column. But again, increasingly driven by our lower brain functions. And as Dan Siegel says, the baby gate of the upper brain gets shut, right? You're less and less able to access your prefrontal cortex, even when you try to do so. Now, when we enter into these states, fear and terror, we get much more compromised in terms of our ability to regulate ourselves or other people or make decisions. And so when we're fearful, we're largely operating out of our midbrain and our brainstem. And what you might see on an arousal continuum is more active tantrums and defiance. And if you're dissociative, right, you've seen people get in this kind of fetal rocking, or I get a hoodie and I pull it over my head and rock, but I'm totally trying to physically withdraw at this point in time and engage in a more primitive rhythmic activity, which is also going to be something we talk about in a few minutes in terms of bottom-up regulation strategies to get us where we need to get. When we're in a fearful state, we aren't even abstract thinkers. We aren't concrete. It's not even emotional. Reactive in that point of time. We're reacting to what comes in front of us in order to try to keep us safe. And our sense of time is really now in the minutes and the seconds. What's in front of me right now, because I'm responding to that level of threat. And then last but not least, once we enter this state of terror, there is very limited capacity to utilize other humans to feel safe and to use any kind of bottom down, right, cognitive ways to calm ourselves whatsoever. So we're completely at this point in the brainstem. You can see animal examples where they're actually faint, pretend they're dead as an escape mechanism. It's that same kind of terror continuum. So brainstem, it's autonomic functioning. It can be that pure amygdala aggression. And when I've talked with folks, I've said that if you stimulate the amygdala by putting an electrical probe on it, the response is instantaneous rage. So this kind of aggression is, I will fight for my life rage. I'm not seeing other people. I have no sense of time right now whatsoever. My cognitive style is reflexive. It's intuitive. It's truly instinctual. It's animalistic, right? I'm just responding in this complete threat-based manner to get myself out of the circumstance. And so very little neocortex functioning, and then this kind of balance between emotion, right? Challenging, intense emotion, and this reflexive brainstem functioning to get us out of whatever situation we need to get into.
This is great. Can I ask you a question about this slide? So we have a question on the chat wondering about the brain regions, the brain region accessibility, and if the breakdowns are different between the alarm stage and the terror state. Do those look drastically different?
You know, now that I look at that, I wonder, based on the question, whether there is a difference. And when I am able to look that up, I will pull that up and respond to that. But
awesome.
They would be more challenged and more driven reflexively. And I'm worried now that I made a typo, if I'm actually honest with you. So I'll have to look at it and make sure. But what we would expect, right, is more so.
Brain is,
yeah.
So maybe even more so.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
It also gives us a break. I just want to say, I hope it's validating to people to understand that if you're not able to get all your work done, if you can't follow through with a thought or get through with your list, it makes complete sense right now.
Right. Well, I was even thinking, you know, the different cognitive functions, right? If we are ourselves and our students are in this state of alert or alarm, like we can't expect that kind of abstract thinking that we want from our students necessarily, because it's just they're not capable of it at the moment, right? So I think in terms of shifting expectations that we have for our students, that's something that we need to keep in mind. I think that probably is the biggest takeaway from this, and in talking with you thus far, for me, is that we can't have the same, you know, standards and expectations for academic work if kiddos can't get out of that state, right? It's not fair of us to expect that. Right. And we should be kind to ourselves too, that we aren't able to think abstractly at this point.
I'm so glad you said that. Nobody is, I mean, if we're lucky on a day like this, we're not going to be completely calm. And to that point, yes, we may teach them that, but the likelihood of retention, like explicit hippocampus driven retention, is really low.
Right. Well, even the idea of hope too, you know, I'm thinking about if we're not constantly in that state of calm, or on any given day or morning, you know, kiddos are in kind of on this end of the continuum, the right end of the continuum. They're if their sense of time is limited, then their capacity for hoping for something better beyond and getting back to school and finishing out the year strong and all of that, that's limited and truncated too. So it's important for us to consider that, right? And have an appropriate response to that, for sure.
And even before that, you hear kids, right? Kids who have trauma or adversity in their background, they will talk about being bored so easily, and it makes them feel crazy. And part of it is just what you're referring to. It's because they don't have a very good sense of time. So it feels like forever. And I've noticed just on a personal level, there are really time distortion during adversity is an interesting topic. And Ruth Lanius writes extensively about this notion. But one of the things I've even noticed about the way time gets distorted, and then I will move us forward, is that in some ways it seems like about 1 million years ago that it was March 13th. And we were looking at closing schools. And in some ways, time goes really fast. Like the course of a day moves actually quite quickly despite the length of time. So I think if we even just begin thinking about what does that mean for us in terms of how we're having that sense of time.
Absolutely. Can I have one more question on this slide before we?
Absolutely.
So we have another question about whether early grief tends to fall under that alarm internal state.
That's a really interesting question. And, I've heard more people on just a variety of calls that I've been on with folks lately talking about the grief process and its relevance to where we are now. And super interesting question. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody talk about the intersection between a grieving process and an alarm. I think, as I think about it, we often move up the arousal scale the more we fear that something will happen to somebody we love. And so I think it would be, I don't know the answer. That's an interesting question to think about when we feel more, when we're grieving more intensely, whether we feel more aroused or not.
Right. Some food for thought.
Some food for thought. I love that. All right, should I continue for a little bit? I just have a couple more.
Great.
Okay, awesome. So right to your point in some ways, Ellen, I wanted to remind folks that the stress response system, when our brain is in that activity, it requires a tremendous amount of energy and resources physically. And maybe this is the continued vein of validating for all of us. And so when we're having not just a day of dealing with this, but the uncertainty of when it's going to end in a week or a month or a year or those kinds of things, it does potentially keep us activated over longer periods of time. And so we know from lots and lots of research that chronic activation of the stress response system results in fatigue and exhaustion and inability to focus, and then, bouts of increased irritability. And I would certainly say that could be true in my own household as well. Name it to tame it, right? So I want to just say just a couple of things based on what we talked about today, some ideas about the management of stress. So stress is inevitable. Distress is inevitable, as I've said many times, and we're not going to avoid this stress, or we often can't remove the stress from people's lives. This is from Bruce Perry, again, with his permission. But the way in which we purposefully titrate our exposure to stress can help. So as you can see here, if you look on the left-hand side, when we experience stress that's unpredictable, and this already has that sense of unpredictability given the unknownness of it, but also stress that is prolonged or extreme, then it makes us more vulnerable, right? We can only hold up so long without taking a toll on our system. It makes us more vulnerable to that. And as I mentioned earlier, it makes the stress response more active. And so it sensitizes, or the kindling effect is the way I've talked about it too. Now, again, without changing circumstances, you can think about what is the degree that I can help these children or help myself or my family or my kids control the predictability of what's happening. How can I keep it as moderate as I can and make it as controllable as I can so that I can build tolerance and resistance in the face of this. And again, we could talk for probably a couple of hours. And in fact, my larger deck is much more about this, but I want to just say a few things based on what we talked about with the stress response system, with this idea that we're thinking, how under the circumstances can my exposure to this be as predictable and moderate and controllable as it can? So we get two ways, as I mentioned earlier, to begin to regulate ourselves. We're talking about this modulation of our regulatory networks. And when we do things like cognitive behavior therapy, or what has driven our world a lot, have been these cerebromodulatory or top down. So that means I'm going to stop my stinking thinking, or I'm going to not catastrophize about this event because it makes it feel worse to me. Those kinds of approaches of using our brain to tell us things that will help us calm down and feel better is one way of calming ourselves down. Now, the problem is, and I'll come back to the other one, as you see, you can't reason with a prefrontal cortex or a neocortex that is not active. So you're not going to mediate thoughts. You're not going to change unhelpful thoughts. If we want, what we are going to have to do is think about these somatosensory bottom-up modulation techniques that people experience. And so what that means is pattern, repetitive, sensory motor activity, which regulates walking, swimming, music, petting my pony, painting. As I painted my office yesterday, I found that was another one of those. And we're not talking about an hour and a half, 3 to 5 minutes. Can I break up my day repeatedly with these some kind of patterned, repetitive types of activities? I hate how the top cuts that part off. It's weird. Anyway, so you can think about these 4 general kinds of regulation that we can engage in. We can engage in this top one, as you see, around self-regulation. So self-soothing. I can drink in my sand tray. I can play with my silly putty. I can engage in some kind of sensory activity, or I can tell myself to not watch the news all day long. I can remind myself that we're taking action to keep ourselves safe, all of those kinds of things. Or I can dissociate, and dissociation is not always a bad thing. We need breaks from things. Sometimes it's okay to distance ourselves and go away. Imagery is a way of doing that. When we read a book, when we watch a television show, and then we need those things right now. And then, as we mentioned earlier, these are these somatosensory. When I say that, you think about any of our 5 senses, the way we take in information, and the ways in which we can use ourselves and other people to begin to regulate ourselves through that. What do we like to touch? What do we like to smell? What do we like to see? Hands down, the most positive kind of regulation we get is this relational regulation, right? So positive co-regulation. But as we've said, there's also co-dysregulation. So if I'm a teacher and I come into this and I am losing my mind today because I'm worried about my family, as I should be, and I come in trying to regulate people, I assure you nothing will happen other than parallel arousal cycle. I would much rather that somebody paused, didn't have their call, changed the time, did something to say I can spend a short amount of time. And aside from this, we've talked about the amount of time that a brain can focus on content, right? So like for a healthy adult, 15 to 20 minutes. Ellen, you and I have talked about this before, right? And then if you're a traumatized kid, 2 to 3 minutes. Now we're all in there. So we're not going to do a half hour. We're not going to do 45 minutes. We're talking little 3 to 5 minute segments, and then something else, patterned repetitive movement or something. And then medications. Almost done here. So I won't spend a ton of time on this, but I want to remind folks of why these bottom-up approaches are so incredibly powerful. And we've talked about the ultimate safety that you ever have is really when you're in the womb, presuming there's no trauma going on for you. And what's happening is all your needs are being met. Your somatosensory needs are all being met at that time. Food, warmth, all those things. You're getting a constant exposure to your mother's heartbeat, somewhere between 40, 60, or 80 beats per minute, which also will be the same tempo that begins to regulate people. when you're born, right? Think about when your baby is born, we rock a baby to help them go to sleep. And then I've been trying to remember what that guy's name that was the technique where you bounce your baby or you bounce. Repetitive, rhythmic bouncing. And when those things happen, and when we're in the context of the close relationship, it causes positive release of hormones and neurotransmitters, and that can relieve stress and help with regulation. So the reason I'm sharing that is we always go back to the foundation in neuroscience. These are deep neural networks that really formed that foundation of safety for us. So bottom up, develop a regulation diet for yourself and kids. Have routine and ritual. And we've talked about pattern rhythmic activity. I'm skipping that. Relationships are the ultimate mediator of fear. Reach out, think about connections we can have given this time. And I'm sure a million people have seen this, but by this time, this switch in language. But I think it's important to reiterate here, use physical distancing rather than social distancing to emphasize emotional closeness and social connectedness. And a really beautiful quote, I have two I'm going to share with you before we're done, this one and another. Try this perspective shift. Instead of seeing social distancing and travel bans as panic, try seeing them as acts of mass cooperation intended to protect the collective whole. This plan isn't about individuals going into hiding. It's about a global deep breath, an agreement between humans around the planet to be still in hopes that the biggest wave can pass without engulfing too many of the vulnerable among us. I just have a couple more, Ellen. Don't forget emotion contagion. It is powerful and it is real and it is biological. Because we have neurons, mirror neurons, we are going to resonate not only with the emotions of others, but with the thoughts and the beliefs of others. And we're counting on each other to put good emotion contagion out in that world. And we do get to control that, and it works. And you even said it earlier, hope, right? And we don't forget hope. Hope literally has the power to change our neurochemistry, the positive release of neurotransmitters. It allows us to adopt healthy behaviors like these regulating strategies we need to do. And we don't have to say people are mentally ill. We don't have to focus on disorders. All we have to do is focus on somebody's sense of hopefulness. And when somebody feels hopeful, mental health symptoms go down. We don't want to forget that during this time as well. Two more. Take control of news exposure. Only get it from reputable sources. Dose it and space it. 5 minutes and then do one of these activities and turn it off. Last piece I want to share with you about connecting with other people. And that's what I think is the most important thing we can do at this time. So the very last thing we need right now is a mindset of mutual distancing. We actually need to be thinking the exact opposite way. Every hand we don't shake must become a phone call that we place. Every embrace we avoid must become a verbal expression of warmth and concern. And every inch and every foot that we physically place between ourselves and another must become a thought as to how we might help that other should the need arise. Let's stay safe. Let's draw one another closer in a way that we have never done before.
That's great. I love both of those quotes. Can you share those with us?
I will. I would love
They're
to
wonderful.
share them with you.
I like the collective breath, the
Yeah.
world collective breath. I think we could use that. That's fantastic.
And it is such a beautiful thing to see, right? You can get swallowed in it, and then I see what people are doing and the amount of empathy and connectedness, and it really does make me hopeful. I mean that.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
We have one question that I think we can kind of both speak to a little bit. So my colleague Catherine has chimed in here, and she was asking, knowing that a lot of students and adults are likely situated in the alert or alarm or the fear states, what are some specific strategies that parents and teachers can offer for learning? So the first thing, based on everything that you just said, is maybe considering weaving in some of those breaks. And encouraging students to get out and do those things either collectively with their family, with their siblings, or even if they're sitting in front of a screen, using some of that class time, virtual classroom time, to do some kind of stress reduction, meditation, breathing exercise, things like that. But are there specific strategies that?
Yeah, moving. I think let's think of what kids like and what they enjoy, because we also want to elevate mood, and we know biologically that it works. So
Yeah.
I think if they want to jump, then let them jump on a trampoline. If they want to bounce on a ball, bounce on a ball. If they can safely play catch with somebody, that works. Play catch with somebody. And
Yeah.
know that any of those things in this time are as important, and probably way more important than any academic trick we're going to teach our kids at this point in time. To see their caregivers support them in a time of distress is way more powerful than anything else we can do.
Great. Well said. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I don't think we have any more comments, though folks should know that we're going to have this on our page. We're also going to post this on nhlearnsremotely.com, which is the department-wide page with lots of resources on there. And we'll get it uploaded to our YouTube channel as well. And who knows, we may have you back if you don't mind.
There's always lots to talk about.
Oh, yeah. We always love chatting with you. So for folks who are tuning in, thank you for tuning in. You can follow us at NH Schools on Twitter, or at NH Student Wellness on YouTube and here on Facebook. We'd love to hear from you if you're looking for certain resources that you haven't found answers to quite yet. And we will be back tomorrow. We're going to have another guest speaker. So stay tuned, watch our calendar, where we've got lots and lots of great experts and practitioners and community partners who are going to be speaking to hopefully help us all through this time and take that collective deep breath as a world and support each other as best we can. So Cassie, as always, thank you so much for educating us, enlightening us, and stay healthy.
Yeah. Be well all.
Thank you.